The Vikings only raided for about 3 months out of every year. The other 9, the most feared warriors in Europe, were farming, arguing in a field, and losing board games by the fire. And on any ordinary morning, the man sharpening his axe might walk past 4 neighbors before breakfast, and statistically, one of them legally belonged to someone else. That's not the part of Viking life that ends up in a movie. The raiding, the burning, the longship cutting through fog, that's maybe 3 months of the calendar. The other 9 is where the real story lives. And before we get into it, we need to fix the picture currently sitting in your head, because it's already wrong. You're picturing horns, a helmet with 2 curved horns jutting off the sides. No Viking ever wore one. Not one has ever been found, anywhere, in over 2 centuries of digging up Viking graves. The image comes from a German opera in 1876, where a costume designer needed something dramatic for the stage, and borrowed the shape from Native American headdresses he'd seen in illustrations. It looked striking under stage lights. It got copied into paintings, then comic books, then Halloween costumes, and eventually it just became what a Viking looks like. 150 years of theater fully replacing the historical record in the public imagination. None of what's coming next is theater. It comes from archaeology, excavated farms, burial sites, gaming pieces still in the dirt, and from the sagas the Vikings wrote about themselves. So picture something different this time. Not a horned helmet, but a one-room house shared with the cows. Most Vikings never set foot in a town in their entire lives. They lived scattered across the countryside in tiny clusters of 6 or 7 farms, the kind of place you'd drive past without noticing. The day started when the rooster called, inside a smoky room where the same fire that kept the family warm kept the animals from freezing too. Breakfast was usually a thick barley porridge, washed down with ale brewed from the same grain. Ale wasn't a treat. It was the safest thing to drink, given to children and the elderly alike. Ale brewing wasn't trivial either. One saga tells of a man named Arnor, who traveled to a trading post just to fetch malt for his own wedding feast, got jumped by a rival on the way home, and lost the whole batch in the fight. Apparently, that was worth fighting over. And buried in the back of nearly every farm's storeroom was something Iceland still eats by the spoonful today: skyr, a thick, fermented dairy product that could outlast fresh milk by months. There was no schedule pinned to a wall. There was a calendar built entirely out of weather and hunger. Spring meant turning frozen soil and pulling lambs into the world. Summer meant cutting and stacking hay, because a bad hay harvest in July meant dead animals in January. Autumn meant slaughtering, salting, and packing meat into barrels of sour whey, because there was no other way through 6 months where the sun barely showed up. And winter, the season everyone assumes was empty and frozen and idle, was actually the busiest season of the year. It just moved indoors. Tool repair, wood carving, and wool. An enormous, almost unreasonable amount of wool. Kids weren't sitting in a classroom through any of this. From the time they could walk, they were hauling water, feeding animals, and stacking firewood, graduating to fishing, weaving, and boat repair as they got older. There was no separate childhood set apart from work. The chores were the education. And by the time a kid was old enough to hold an axe, they'd already spent a decade learning the actual machinery that ran the household. Hold on to that wool detail. We'll come back to it, and it's going to change how you see this entire story. Because underneath all that ordinary farm labor was a hierarchy most people have never heard of, and it wasn't gentle. At the bottom were thralls, slaves, full stop, with no legal protection at all. One historian who specializes in Norway puts the number at 1 in 4 people. Not 1 in 4 somewhere far away. 1 in 4 people standing in the same field, eating in the same room, doing the worst jobs nobody else wanted. The digging, the mucking, the hauling. Some thralls were captured on raids. Just as many, by the same research, were born into it, or sold into it to clear a debt. Some were even born into it through their own master's bloodline, fathered by the man who owned them, and still raised as property. This wasn't a footnote at the edge of Viking society. It was the labor engine running directly underneath it. Above the thralls were carls, free farmers, the actual majority of the population, the people this entire story is really about. Above them were jarls, who owned the land the carls worked and almost never got their hands dirty. But the strangest job on the Viking calendar wasn't farming. And it wasn't raiding either. Once a year, something happened that looked almost nothing like the rest of their lives. Free men packed up, walked for days, and gathered in an open field for 2 straight weeks. They called it a thing. The biggest one, in Iceland, started in the year 930, and it's technically still running today, making it one of the oldest parliaments on Earth. No king stood up and handed down a ruling. Free men stood in a field and argued out loud until disputes got settled by something close to a vote. It's the most familiar part of Viking life to anyone watching this today, and somehow, it's the one part that never makes it into a single film. And once the work and the arguing were done, at night, around the fire, they played games. It's called Nefatafel, one side defending a king piece at the center, the other trying to surround and trap it. The same core idea modern chess still runs on. Dig through almost any Viking-era site in Europe, and you'll find small carved gaming pieces by the dozen. One excavated English winter camp alone turned up over 280 of them, worn smooth from use. The same men remembered for burning villages were, on an average night, hunched over a board, losing to a friend by firelight. None of that, the farming, the slavery, the field full of arguing free men, the board games, explains how a handful of scattered farmers turned into an empire that reached 3 continents and terrified half of Europe. And the answer isn't the axe. Remember how we said the picture in your head was already wrong once tonight? It's about to happen again. Picture the longship. You're picturing the wood, the carved dragon head, the long rows of oars cutting the water in rhythm. That's the part every movie shows you. But the wood isn't what got that ship across an ocean. The sail did. And the sail was wool. The same wool we told you to hold on to an hour's worth of farm chores ago. Researchers rebuilt Viking ships at full scale to figure out exactly what that sail actually cost. And the number is almost absurd. A single warship with a crew of around 65 men needed more than 1.5 tons of wool and somewhere between 50 and 60 years of hand labor just to clean, spin, and weave it into cloth. 50 years for one sail. No single person could ever produce that alone in a lifetime. It took dozens of women working together indoors through winter after winter, long before that ship ever touched salt water. This is also exactly where the word spinster comes from. Today, it means an unmarried woman, slightly old-fashioned, slightly judgmental. Back then, it meant nothing more than exactly what it sounds like, a woman who spins. It wasn't an insult. It was a job description for the single most economically essential labor in the entire society. Now scale that one sail up across an entire fleet. By the middle of the 11th century, researchers estimate the Viking world was sailing on roughly 1 million square meters of woven cloth, the wool equivalent of about 2 million sheep, sheared and spun entirely by hand. 2 million sheep's worth of labor, done by women who never picked up a weapon, never set foot on a longship, and get exactly 0 screen time in every version of this story we've ever been handed. Take the wool away, and there is no Viking Age. There's just a few hundred angry men standing on a beach holding axes with absolutely nowhere to go. So here's the actual lesson sitting underneath all of it. Twice tonight, we corrected the picture in your head. First the helmet, then the ship. And both times, the real version turned out to be quieter and less photogenic than the myth. That's not a coincidence specific to Vikings. The loud, violent, photogenic moment is never the thing that actually built anything. It's the thousands of unglamorous hours nobody filmed, nobody wrote down, and nobody put in the opera. Every empire you've ever read about was built the same way, quietly, by people the story conveniently leaves out. The raid was just the visible 3 months. The other 9 were always where the real work happened. Remember that man from the opening? The one sharpening his axe past 4 neighbors? Statistically, by the time he sailed, somebody back home was already covered in wool dust, weeks deep into a sail that would take decades to finish. History remembers the axe. It should probably remember the wool.